The next track emphasizes on informal economy concerns, contributions and challenges for the future. The knowledge partner for this track is Institute of Human Development, IHD. And the track will be chaired by Dr. Alak Sharma. I extend my warm greetings to Dr. Sharma, Dr. Srivastava, Dr. Arup Mitra, and Dr. G. Mol Unim. Without further delay, Dr. Sharma, sir, I now hand over the dais to you.
I would like to first thank Symbiosis International University, particularly Dr. Jyoti Chandramani, for providing IHD, giving this opportunity to be knowledge partner of this important event. Friends, since yesterday evening and today morning also, you have been hearing a lot about informal sector. And informal sector or informal employment is a very important part of our daily discourse on employment. Its incidence is, you can see anywhere, it is very high in city, villages, everywhere. But those who have read economics know that our theories do not say that this has been a permanent characteristics of development process. The developed countries had very small, rather negligible percentage of informal employment earlier. Now there also this incidence is emerging. But as we know from Arthur Lewis' thesis, he had theorized that as the development process starts, the employment transfer of labor from subsistence sector to moderate sector takes place. There is unlimited supply of labor, and till this process will continue, till wages will rise above subsistence sector. Many countries have experienced this process. Many people think that China is experiencing, or rather several parts of China, particularly Eastern China, has already experienced this kind of development. But most of the developing countries have not experienced this kind of transition. And as we know from Harris-Terraro model, they had thought that in urban sector, informal sector is a stepping stone towards formal sector. This has also not happened. India is a prime example where 93% of all employment is informal employment, and 84% of our employment is in informal sector. So, in fact, India is one of those countries globally where incidence of informal employment or informal sector is highest. It is higher than, much higher than most of the developing countries. China, it is only around 30%. Even our neighboring South Asian countries have also a smaller share of informal employment compared to India. But this definition of informal sector differ across various countries. Although ILO has tried to standardize it, ILO largely defines informal sector as all unincorporated enterprises owned by households. In India, and thanks to our statistical system and also National Commission on Enterprises in the informal sector, in which two of the panelists work, Dr. Ravi Srivastava and Dr. Jimol Unim, it has provided a very robust definition of informal sector and informal employment. In fact, informal employment in India became largely in discourse, became popular thanks to the NCUSA, and according to which all unincorporated enterprises below 10 workers, as per factory acts in manufacturing or similar other acts in other sectors, are informal sector. Also, all unincorporated enterprises where workers does not have any social security. So, in India, we can define informal sector largely as all those who are own account workers, and own account workers are mandated. It is one of the highest in the world. Around 50% of all workers in India are self-employed, own account workers, or contributing family members. Wage workers, casual workers will be around 30-32%, and 18% are regular workers, and all regular workers are not formal workers. So, as I said, 93% of employment in India is informal employment. From this definition, you can very well understand that informal sector is very, very heterogeneous. You see in the street hawkers, vendors, coolies, they also belong to informal sector. On the other hand, also large cultivators, self-employed, high-earning doctors or engineers or lawyers, they also belong to informal sector. So don't think that informal sector is a very homogeneous category. It is highly heterogeneous. In fact, it has been estimated that in India, around 1/3 of the informal sector workers, are not poor. They are either rich or, in any case, they are not poor. And many of these, some parts of this informal sector is dynamic also. They are less than 10 workers, but they are dynamic. They are linked with formal sector. Their demand, pattern, export earnings, and all that. It is such that it can be called a dynamic sector. So, given all that, this part of the informal sector needs to be studied separately from the very subsistent sector about which I just talked about, hawkers, vendors, and similar self-employed petty traders and all that. In the morning session, and also Dr. Martin Rana told us about how technology is transforming. And now informal sector, informal employment is taking a very, very different pattern. We know about gig economy. It is still small in India compared to the developed countries. But now that, and as Dr. Rama was saying, workers who are part of the platform economy, where crowd work is shared, and also app-based like Ola, Uber, it is very difficult to say whether they are self-employed or wage workers. Their employment is recorded, but they don't have any minimum wages, they are not guided by any regulation. So this is a new phenomenon. And in future, this is going to be more pronounced. This pattern right now is in some sectors, but as I said that this is going to be pronounced gradually. Friends, You can visualize that informal sector is really heterogeneous, and it is very difficult to do justice with this in 1.5 hours. But we have 3 panelists who have worked extensively on informal employment and informal sector. As I said, Dr. Ravi Srivastava was member of the Informal Sector, National Commission on Informal Sector. Dr. Jimol Wani also worked there. Arup Mitra has been working a lot. So this is a very, very distinguished panel. I won't take much time. I would first invite Dr. Arup Mitra to take around 15 minutes. We have 1 hour and 30 minutes. I understand that he will be speaking on general informal sector, its linkage with migration, poverty, to what extent demand factors or supply push factors determine its pattern, and all these issues. So these are very, very important issues. And Dr. Arup Mitra, you have your floor now.
Thank you, Professor Sharma. Thank you, Professor Jyoti, for giving me this opportunity to share my research findings with you. One important manifestation of informal sector, particularly during the late 70s and early 80s, we get to see is in terms of working poor. And slowly, the concept has undergone a tremendous evolution, and many new insights have been developed. Keeping in view the important role the informal sector plays in providing sources of livelihood, this paper tries to focus on 3 important aspects. It tries to delineate the recent changes that are being observed in the informal sector, particularly how contractualization and ancillarization have impacted on the work practices and performance of the informal sector. Then we try to decompose the informal sector in terms of the supply push phenomenon and the demand-induced component. Of course, it is not all that easy, and we have made certain attempts which I will try to display. And thirdly, we try to reflect on the formal-informal sector relationship, whether it is of generative type or whether it is parasitic in nature. But if as Gary Fields argued, that if economic growth is taking place in the formal sector, naturally, through ancillarization and subcontracting, the percolation effect should work, and the wages and productivity in the informal sector are supposed to rise. So hence poverty reduction should take place. So in the backdrop of these views, we would try to examine some of the propositions. I take you to the NSS data. Of course, we understand there are several limitations. Professor Unni will talk about the limitations of the data. Nevertheless, with certain assumptions, we get to see that in the rural areas, in the non-agricultural activities, more than 70% of the workforce was engaged in the informal sector, and in the urban areas also about 67% were engaged in the informal sector. Now, one important class, of course, the criticisms are that the household workers have not been included in this estimate. So naturally, if you include them, the estimates would be much higher than this. Now, one class of literature which has come up in the recent past, that how urbanization has been contributing to the demand-induced component of the informal sector, and whether the linkages between the formal and informal sector are getting strengthened, and whether poverty reduction is actually taking place. In the backdrop of that, ADB had actually initiated a study for both India and China. They call it dragons and elephants, cities in dragons and elephants. And there they had asked me to sort of assess the impact of urbanization on informal sector employment. I would try to draw some of the findings from that particular study. So here we get to see across states, this is the pattern of relationship that we get to see between urbanization and informal sector employment. And when we try to sort of get the estimated line, there is certainly not any pattern. It's almost a horizontal line. So that means the informal sector share is high in states which are having very low urbanization level, and also in states which have very low and high levels of urbanization level. some of the new trends which are emerging, and we conducted some qualitative survey in the Sundarnagari area, Trans-Yamuna area in Delhi, and what we found that for some of the products which are sold under the name of certain specific companies, quality consciousness exists, and thus the better performers tend to receive the consignments abundantly and regularly. However, this process does not lead to any rise in wage rates, as the better performers are still large in number. In fact, it is a buyer's market. The contractors set the price and no negotiation is possible to revise it in any manner. Now, what we have done, we have tried to now decompose the informal sector in terms of the supply push effect and the demand induced component. In order to do that, we have taken recourse to late Professor Papula's hypothesis that the informal sector can grow in the situation of when the formal sector is growing very rapidly, and informal sector can also grow when the formal sector is growing sluggishly or almost stagnant. And that is the pattern which we have observed across states in relation to urbanization. So there we are trying to specify the informal sector employment as a function of formal sector employment. So how much of the informal sector employment can be explained in terms of the formal sector employment? And then we are using a statistical stochastic frontier function framework, which would decompose the error into U and V. That is, U would represent the distance from the frontier that is explained by the formal sector employment. So higher is the distance, higher is the excess supplies of labor in the informal sector. And in a state, if it is exactly explained by the formal sector employment, that means there is no excess supplies of labor in the informal sector. So given that postulation, we have worked out the index for both the years 99, 2000 and 2000. It doesn't change. So what I have tried to do, I have worked out the index for each of the states, and Mizoram is one state which turns out to be the state of highest excess supplies of labor. And keeping that as the benchmark, we have worked out the index for all other states for two different years, that is 99-2000 and 2004-05. What is interesting to point out is that what we are able to see here is that Mizoram turned out to be the state of highest excess supplies of labor, and taking that as the benchmark, we have then indexed the rest of the states. And we have worked out these indices in such a manner that 99-2000 and 2004-05 indices should be comparable. And the interesting point is that states which had revealed very low level of excess supplies of labor have experienced a tremendous rise. For example, Maharashtra. The index was only 35 in 99-2000, and in 2004-05 it has gone up to 68. So which tends to suggest that in most of the states in the recent years, the extent of excess supply induced component is increasing more rapidly. Now I draw your attention to a much larger analysis where we have tried to link the informal sector employment, migration, poverty, and many other important correlates. So what we have done, we have taken the data from the NSS on migration, poverty, informal sector employment, and from population census, that is from 2011, we have collected the information on socioeconomic and demographic characteristics. And, as a sort of stepping stone, we have worked out a factor analysis, and these are some of the very important findings. On a large number of variables, the factor analysis which has been carried out reveals that higher rural literacy tends to raise the migration rate, moderately though. The percentage of scheduled castes in rural areas also has a positive impact on the migration rate, supporting the view that the disadvantaged sections migrate to escape their vulnerability. The most interesting part is that migration reduces both rural and urban poverty. This is, however, not a very strong pattern emerging from the cross-sectional data. Higher urbanization and work participation rate in both rural and urban areas are positively associated with migration, suggesting that those in the labor market are more likely to migrate, and after migration they are likely to continue in the labor market. Such patterns are more prevalent in states which are more urbanized than the others. Migration, urban informal sector employment, the incidence of scheduled caste population representing your lower social categories in the urban and rural areas are all positively connected with each other, which again suggests that the socially backward groups are more likely to migrate and land up in the urban informal sector. However, this pattern is accompanied by a decline in the incidence of poverty in both rural and urban areas, though again in nominal terms. Urbanization takes the highest factor loading and is associated positively with the percentage of the rural and urban workforce engaged in non-household manufacturing and services. Also, urbanization is negatively related to rural and urban poverty. So, subscribing to the agglomeration literature, we get to see that urbanization has certain positive spillover effect in terms of the growth of the dynamic component within the informal sector and also reduction in rural and urban poverty. The relationship between urbanization and informal sector employment is not very distinct as we had shown in the graphical analysis, and here also it doesn't turn out to be very distinct when we are trying to look at the correlation, but through this complex factor analysis we are able to see the indirect beneficial effects of urbanization on informal sector employment. Now, given this as a stepping stone, we have worked out a small simultaneous equation model where the rural to urban migration rate, informal sector employment and urban poverty are the three endogenous variables, and based on the cross-sectional data we have estimated this simultaneous equation model. I will not go into the technical details, I'll just summarize the results. What it shows that migration and urban informal sector employment are closely connected. Migrants do not necessarily move in search of jobs within the formal sector only. Even the possibility to work in the informal sector induces population mobility across space. Further, rural and urban poverty are connected through migration. So I'm not denying that if rural poverty increases, urban poverty will also increase. I'm not denying that fact, it does exist. But at the same time, through migration, there is a possibility that urban poverty can decline. So within the informal sector, there is scope that upward mobility, upward income mobility can take place. And elsewhere we have tried to work out in the light of the network literature. So what we found that the network is very important for an entry to the urban job market. But those who are able to diversify their networks are the ones who have experienced upward mobility. If network concentration exists along the lines of caste kinship bonds, then they are not able to diversify their networks and they are not able to experience any upward mobility. Now I move on to the enterprise survey data of the NSS, where we use the unorganized manufacturing, trade and services. Now, two important hypotheses have come up in this context. One is to what extent rural clusterization and urban clusterization are taking place simultaneously, so that convergence can be perceived. On the other hand, the other view is that manufacturing clusterization, the absence of manufacturing clusterization may result in the clusterization of trade and services activities. So keeping these two standpoints in view, we have tried to again look at the patterns at the state level, and from the factor analysis, what we get to see is that there are two important clusters, rural and urban. In other words, there is no convergence. States which are showing higher shares in terms of unorganized manufacturing, trade and services are not the ones which have also shown higher shares in the urban context. Secondly, manufacturing, trade and services all are going together. It is not true that there is a trade-off between the manufacturing on the one hand and the tertiary sector on the other hand. Now, coming to the determinants of employment and wages in the unorganized manufacturing trade and services, we have used the unit level data, and two important views. That is, one is what is the elasticity of employment in the unorganized manufacturing trade and services with respect to value added and with respect to wages. Now, with respect to value added, we get to see that the elasticity is very high. That's partly because they are all using the labor-intensive techniques. With respect to wages, it is almost 0.5 and negative and 0.5, which is much larger than that in the formal sector, organized manufacturing sector. Now, the other important question which comes up, that to what extent, as many other studies have argued, that the informal sectors are getting more and more integrated, at least one component of the informal sector, through subcontracting and ancillarization. So to what extent it is actually benefiting the workers in terms of employment creation and in terms of productivity being transferred to the workers in terms of wages. So in both the equations for employment and in the productivity wage relationship, where we are specifying wage as a function of productivity and many other control variables, we have introduced a contract dummy. That is, if the unit in the informal sector has a contract from the formal sector, to what extent it is benefiting in terms of employment creation and in terms of productivity growth and wage growth. And in all these equations, which are based on several thousands of observations, the contract dummy turns out to be extremely insignificant. So keeping all these observations together, if we try to bring them together, what it appears that it is true that within one component of the informal sector, the dynamism is growing, and it is possible to reduce poverty even when there is not much connection with the formal sector. But at the same time, when there is a linkage between the formal and the informal sector, not necessarily the advantages are percolating down through those linkages. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Arup Mitra, for your within time limit, you have presented a very comprehensive paper, and some of the points which you brought out are very important. This formal informal sector linkages. Generally, it is thought that it is very strong, but you also gave cautionary note. Also, the relationship between migration, poverty, and informal sector, as well as supply push and demand induced factors. So thank you very much. Now I invite Professor Ravi Srivastava. He has told me that he will be speaking on retail, trade and construction sector. These are two sectors in informal sector which are very large and which have seen a lot of modernization in recent period. They have modern component as well as a traditional component. So,
begin with a big thanks to Symbiosis and Jyotiji for inviting me here, and for all the scintillating presentations that I've heard since yesterday. Let me begin by just laying down a little bit of or commenting on the general context of the discussion since yesterday, because I really found it very interesting. Mr. Bhargava, although he comes from industry, not from academia, made extremely interesting points yesterday. Let me just underscore some of the points that he made. He said, well, we are now witnessing our transition from formal jobs to informal jobs. So the old world of work, as we recognized it earlier, may indeed cease to exist, and we need to think about this. He also said that the outsourcing is happening on a larger and larger scale. So jobs which were created within establishments are now created in other kinds of establishments. And this, of course, also means that there would be new kinds of linkages between formal sector establishments and informal sector establishments. He did not talk about value chains and global value chains, but this outsourcing, of course, is a relationship which expresses itself in different ways across the globe. And then he said that this also means the sectoral boundaries are becoming extremely fuzzy. when we know that the distinction between manufacturing and service sector is becoming very fuzzy in a number of ways. And this is something which actually Mr. Martinrama also presented in one single slide, how these changes are happening. Now, for our students here, I think the interesting thing is to then visualize or reflect on what does it mean for the world and how will the world move, because we, traditional development economics and Dr. Alak Sharma talked about these transitions that we have usually felt that development would be experiencing, transition from agriculture to manufacturing and then to services, from rural areas to urban areas, and from informal to formal job subsistence as we move. What does all this mean? What does this transition where actually, what is the kind of transition that we will be having in future? Mr. Rama made a very salient point, which I have also said in many other contexts. When we look at labor markets, actually developed country labor markets are beginning to look more and more like a developing country labor markets, with more self-employment, with part-time work, with multiple jobs, with non-standard employment, something we've always lived with and have tried to measure. So basically, what does all this mean, for the challenge of employment in future? And more than the challenge of employment, what does it mean for the economy? What kind of economy are we visualizing? So this actually goes beyond this question of just looking at employment. And I think this is something which we as students of economics need to think a little more deeply. Where should we be headed in the world of work, but outside also the world of work? But of course, some things don't change. And the inexorable speed with which technology moves has possibly become faster and faster. And here there is an interesting paradox, that when we talk about development transitions, we are visualizing or we are failing to visualize. There are challenges in visualizing the kind of world that we are moving to. But when we look at technological changes, then there is still inbuilt in the whole debate a kind of technological determinism, that we'll be using the same kind of technologies with the same kind of, labor coefficients and so on. And this will happen both across the developed world and the developing world. So the speed with which the fourth industrial revolution should happen, the impacts, we visualize them happening similarly. I think this is the stage, and again I'll come to what the Vice Chancellor, and in fact the Chancellor at lunch was saying, Jyoti was saying it, and others were saying, doesn't this mean that we should also think about the development paradigm? Doesn't it mean also that we in developing countries, given the kind of resources that we have, the kind of labor resources that we have and other resources, shouldn't we fundamentally also be thinking about the kind of development paradigm where, and shouldn't we also be saying that our policies should reflect changes in or a different development paradigm rather than the same development paradigm? And this is something, of course, we in India have been used to thinking, but we never front-end this in the policy discourse. And I think this is something very important. The other lesson, the other takeaway from the discussions yesterday is that a lot of our discussion get focused on the top end of the jobs pyramid, the works pyramid. So when we talk about informal jobs also, the fact that they can be very often demand-led, and Alak talked about the heterogeneity in the informal sector, we're really talking about the top of the jobs pyramid. We're not really talking about the bottom of the jobs pyramid, very thick wedge, which is the bottom of the jobs pyramid. And what do changes mean? And it is in this context that I'm going to be presenting this paper. Actually, this paper, which many colleagues here have seen, because Reema Nanavati, who's in SEWA, was one of the commissioners of the ILO Future of Work team. And when she went to the first meeting of the commissioners, he found that the discourse was so heavily centered on northern countries and the organized sector that there was very little discussion of the kind of the world of work that we live in, which is the unorganized sector. And we worked with her to produce a series of papers on what would the future of work look like in a country like India, which is dominated by the unorganized sector. And it is in this context that I did some work which I'm not at all used to doing. We don't do very much as economists crystal ball gazing. And when we look at Something we look at basically the immediate future in terms of crises and so on, but not really what systemic changes are going to engulf the world of work. So in this context, I looked at these two sectors, the retail sector and the construction sector, both being extremely important sectors. And they are very important sectors not just in India, but they're also very important sectors globally. So I'll present and the reason, and of course these sectors, like many other sectors, are dominated by the unorganized sector in terms of the share of unemployment and dominated by informal employment, but there is an important and growing segment of the organized sector in both of them. So this is the context in which I did this work. Now, since the presentation is long, I don't think I'll have really time to go through the presentation. I'll be skipping many of the slides or going through them at a very rapid pace. So we know that both globalization and technological changes are having and will continue to have a very significant impact on work. And the recent technologies, which we often call, say, disruptive technologies, which we term as the fourth industrial revolution, robotics, AI, machine learning, Internet of Things, etc., are part of the way which are going to impact on the world of work and on employment. And several major outcomes are likely. Some of them have already been mentioned. In fact, Mr. Rama mentioned this, that employment, in fact, most of them have been mentioned. First is that employment may decline significantly in several lines of work, both low skilled and routinized, but often actually we don't talk about it, also highly skilled work. Lawyers, doctors, and so on. Also, many of their jobs are going to be taken over by AI and other the technological changes. Although the significance of the magnitude of the impact is still as a matter of debate, and he presented, in fact, 2 estimates from the World Bank itself. The second is, and I think we are fairly definite about this, that the gap between types of work will increase, and this will further increase labor market inequality. On this, there is a greater degree of consensus, as also the fact that there will be a trend towards non-standard forms of work. Standard social security arrangements will become obsolete or nearly obsolete with the course of time. And then, the reshoring and other implications will perhaps lead to fresh global spatial restructuring, which we need to think about. So, with all these changes, what are the implications for developing countries such as India? Now, in the case of India, the thing is that sometimes we don't really visualize that our production structure straddles all successive industrial revolutions. The use of traditional technology still persists along with the most modern technologies. Half our workforce is in agriculture. And I just give you some figures of all non-agricultural enterprises, 66.4% are own account enterprises. Nearly 84% work in the unorganized sector enterprises and 93% informal workers. Among heads of household operating own account enterprises, 40% are illiterate and 1/3 only with primary or middle level education. Among employees of establishments, and this is people employing workers, 1/5 illiterate and only 1/4 had primary or middle level education. Among farmers, who are also, of course, producers, 54% illiterate. And among all incorporated enterprises, only 3 to 2.2% owned computers in the last survey, and only 1.7% use the internet. So this is the kind of, actually, if you look at it from this employer perspective and establishment perspective, this is the kind of situation where we're looking at technological changes. Now, there's retail and construction, if you look at globally, and this is ILO stat data, both are extremely important, which with construction, employing, of total employment, anything depending on the kind of countries we're talking about, contributing to 3% to 9% of employment. And with the retail sector actually contributing a much larger percentage from 12% to 24% of employment in different groups of countries. So these are very, very important sectors. And just to, the retail sector represents the largest employer in many countries. The only point I would like to underscore is that the structure of retail is very different across countries. And there are many countries still where retail is still dominated by small enterprises. even household enterprises. Even in developed countries, you have a whole variety of establishments as far as retail is concerned. And if you, but this is an industry in which enormous changes in the enterprise type and in the organization of work are taking place. Physical retail is being constantly downsized almost everywhere. So changes are being spurred by growth in digital technologies and fourth, IR technologies, but the existing and future impact differs significantly across countries depending on industry attributes, socioeconomic attributes of consumers, government policies and regulations. So there is no uniformity in the way we visualize all this. And with the kind of changes that you are taking place, physical retail, of course, is going back, and employment is shifting. But overall, there is no evidence of a very significant decline in aggregate retail employment. But within this, the precarity of employment is going up, particularly in physical retail, and the precarity of employment is particularly going up for women workers who constitute the majority in retail in most countries. India is an exception where we have a very small percentage, but this is, and there is of course a great deal of variation across countries in the extent to which different kinds of organized formats are currently penetrated or expected to penetrate. Now, construction is a more complicated sector, more complicated industry. As most of you know, it consists of these two segments, buildings and civil engineering, and it constitutes 6% of global GDP and consumes 50% of global steel production. Workers represent 5 to 10% across most countries. Now, the interesting thing about construction is that many very significant technological changes are taking place in construction. Off-site production has increased. The use of fourth IR technologies has increased. But despite all these changes, if you look at the aggregate productivity trends in construction globally, there is not very much change, as also the level of employment. So there's no significant decline across the sector in aggregate sense. And I think one of the reasons why, in fact, there's not a greater penetration of modern technologies is because the industry is very fragmented. And this is something which you see not only, this you see even more in India, but even globally. The fragmentation of the industry, subcontracting is an issue which limits the penetration of much of modern technology. So despite the fact that these technological changes are there, the fact of the matter is that when you look at aggregate employment, then aggregate employment is actually not really declining very significantly, and there's no, at the moment, very dire predictions on what would happen to employment certainly don't seem to be really the case. Now, I just want to very quickly look at the Indian case, which is, of course, what we want to focus on. Both these industries, retail and construction, are very important for us. Construction, in the last instance, employed about 50 million workers, and retail provided about 40 million workers. In both these industries, I will skip most of the detail. We can go into them at some stage. If you look at the structure of industry, gender, women constitute about 12 to 15%. So the retail sector is an anachronism because women in the sector here are much lower than what is globally the case, what is the case in East Asia and so on. If you look at it in detail, the presence of the organized sector surprisingly is much larger in construction than in retail. And even if you look at the projections which are made, over the next 5 to 10 years, the share of organized sector construction would continue to be larger than in retail. Technological changes are happening in both the sectors, both in construction and in retail, but the impact of what is happening is different across these two sectors. Because if you look at retail, for example, the employment elasticity to growth in retail has been coming down. There is a trend of employment elasticity in retail actually declining over a period of time. So that has been happening because of various reasons, and if you then break it up, then the trend is certainly more pronounced in urban areas in the recent period than in the rural areas. As far as construction is concerned, the employment elasticity has been more or less static over a period of time. It's been actually very close to 1, surprisingly. So productivity has been more or less stagnant in the construction sector over a period of time, and that continues to be the case. But if you look at the scenario, in the scenario that we have a situation where organized retail, the use of IT and so on is going up, in particularly when you look at the retail sector. But despite this, these formats will still will provide or cater to a very small but growing segment of employment. If you look at construction, once again the use of modern technologies is going up, particularly prefab, off-site construction and so on. But again, these still account for a fairly small segment of the activity. And one of the reasons why absorption of new technologies is going to be low, particularly in construction, is the same as the reason that I mentioned globally, which is that the construction industry is extremely fragmented. And there's a lot of outsourcing that happens. And that limits the possibilities of technological modernization of the kind that many builders would like to happen in India. So let me just to give you the two concluding these things. One is, so if I look at this thing, so basically if I look at, let me conclude, because I think so as far as if you look at both these sectors together, then the construction sector employment has been growing at a very rapid pace. Retail sector is employment growth rate has been declining. And the construction sector actually is very important because it's been the major sector. In fact, retail also, major sector for workers exiting out of agriculture. Now, if you look at the scenario, although the modern technological changes are not going to have major impacts on these sectors, but the employment growth rate of construction will also slow down in future. Is also going to slow down, and this is going to have a major, this will pose a tremendous challenge to where do we absorb workers who want to get out of agriculture. So the growth, the kind of non-agricultural growth that we visualize is really going to be, we need to visualize the kind of non-agricultural growth, the kind of non-farm growth which will absorb workers who want to exit agriculture, whereas we know, productivity is not rising rapidly enough and income differentials are very high. In both, therefore, the point that I want to make is that do we only look at do we look at this whole, both these sectors, construction and retail, in going unidirectionally in the area of the absorption of new technologies, the modern formats of retail, organized retail, IR, or do we also visualize a different future for these two sectors? For example, in the area of retail, do we also, if you look at many countries across the world are actually looking at linkages between local producers and retail, whether it is in not just farm produce, not just but in many other production. And when in Seva, for example, the founder of Seva has talked about this 100-mile economy, where you actually look at local linkages. And when you look at local linkages combined with the organization of retail producers, then you can construct the retail economy in a different way. So you don't need to visualize a top-down retail economy which depends upon IT and all that, but you can visualize a bottoms-up retail economy which depends upon the local economy. In construction also, if you think in terms of low-cost technologies which are environment-friendly technologies, these technologies can be more decentralized. They can also be more labor-absorbing. The point that I'm making is that we need to think also in terms of both, whether we think, we need to think of paradigms where we encourage policies which are more environmentally friendly, which are more worker friendly, and of course train and skill our workers to participate in the future, but not to think of the future moving only in one particular technological, along one particular technological axis. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Ravi Srivastava, for providing us a very good overview and also emerging challenges with respect to construction sector and retail sector, which are the two largest employers of informal sector employment after agriculture. So may I now invite Dr. Jimoluni. She will be talking on informal sector enterprises, their growth.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me start by thanking Jyoti ji and Prasalak Sharma for kind of coaxing, cajoling, forcing me to appear here. And let me say that I really enjoyed this whole conference. And also, I've had the opportunity to meet a lot of students, both here and in Flame University, which is across one of these hills here. And it's been a great time in Pune and at the conference. And I think the first session that we had this morning was quite a wonderful one. I mean, posed in that fashion, I think it was really a very interesting thing. So I have an obsession with the lower segments of employment. And like Professor Ravi was saying that we have been focusing on a lot of the discussion on technology, employment and so on, we focus on the upper segments. So my interest in informal sector, but even within informal sector, the segments within the informal sector has always been my concern for quite a number of years. So now after Aroop's very detailed research presentation and Ravi's so-called crystal ball gazing, I'll make a very simple presentation and I'll try to do it in 10 minutes. But of course, we professors have a problem. Once we start talking, we don't know where to stop. Okay, so I'll be basically talking about some statistics in employment on using the economic census data, which is an enterprise-based data, and the NSSO's Informal Enterprises Survey. We've had two of them now in 9, 10 and 11, 12. And these are different from what Aroop was talking about, which were the unorganized manufacturing, trade and so on, which is the earlier versions of in enterprise surveys by the NSSO was based on the particular sector, but now we have a combined one. Of course, after all the controversies we've been having with PDLF and so on, we're not sure whether these will continue either. Okay, so now this is part of some of the stuff that I presented to Amit's group for the State of Working India report, and also part of a book that I'm doing on women enterprises and the drivers of women enterprises. We're calling it the middle class, but the middle class itself, we sort of think that it's segmented into upper and lower middle classes. So it comes down to my interest. I won't do too much of the actual exercise, won't talk too much about the actual exercise, but we had, so the broad objective was to examine what has been the growth of informal enterprises using economic census data and NSSO data. And when it comes to data, we all know that enterprise data always underestimates both enterprises and definitely enterprises the number of workers. So it's not a very exact estimate of number of workers, and it might not also be an absolute this thing of the quantity of number of enterprises. A survey of informal sector done through the labor force survey, it always gives a much better estimate of informal sector. And as I mentioned in the morning, now that we have this definition of informal sector and we have another definition another 10 years down the line, 1993 we had the informal sector definition from the ILO, and then which Prasalak Sharma talked about, and then we had after 10 years in 2003 the ICLS came up with the informal employment definition, which is based on the work status, so whether the person gets social protection and so on and so forth. One is based on enterprise and the other. And most times when we say 93% of the workers are in the informal sector, we are really talking about the informal employment definition. But here we're going to talk about enterprises, to whatever limited fashion that we can. And then we also look at what kind of enterprises do expand, and these informal enterprises do expand. So there I come to this from, of course, it's my obsession. But on the first day, I happened to be the only person from outside who listened to this talk by Professor Raja and Professor Lisa from the McGill or whatever university in Australia. And I found it objectionable when Professor Raja was was defining and showing us that vulnerable workers are own account workers and unpaid family workers. I sort of questioned him on that because I think that casual workers and contract workers may be much more vulnerable. But when he showed the proportion and the change over time, he was referring to own account workers. So when my contention is that own account workers are also segmented, like Professor Alex Sharma was trying to say. There are enterprises which are dynamic and driven and expanding, and there are enterprises which are just are on a subsistence basis, are running on a subsistence basis. To categorize all of them as being vulnerable workers, I thought was not quite doing justice to the dynamism which exists within the informal sector. Because if we didn't have that dynamism in the informal sector, we would not have even your 7% rate of growth, or whatever rate of growth, because of the number of enterprises that it actually consists of. All right, so now this is the economic census. So the economic census data, the latest rounds have been in 98, 2005 and 2013. So they give us the the numbers of all enterprises, and then they give us own account enterprises. So own account enterprises is not is not the only thing in the informal sector, because you can have self-employed enterprises which are hiring workers also in the informal sector, but this can be treated as a very large component of the informal enterprises, the own account enterprises. They had an estimate in 2013 of 58.2 million enterprises, total enterprises in India, out of which almost I think 80% were, or I don't seem to have the number here, were own account enterprises. But what I want to show here is that there has been, if one considers that all enterprises are more or less the larger establishments and more or less formal, they can't be all formal. And own account enterprises are the informal and much larger segment of it. If you look at the growth or the change of total enterprises, which agriculture and non-agriculture was the first row, and non-agricultural enterprises alone, if you look at the second period between 2005 and 2013, there has been the rate of growth has been higher. So just year on year, has been higher for own account workers than it has been for these are not workers, these are enterprises. Okay, and this is true for industry. Within industry, manufacturing is one of those where the own account enterprises have been growing at a faster pace. In services, you find hotels and food, and the transport sector has been growing in terms of enterprises at a faster rate in this second period, which is 2005 to 2013. So there has been growth of informal enterprises in the when you're using the economic census data. Another feature about this economic census data is that, so these are, like I said, when the whole issue of the informal sector employment definition came up, and all these questions were included in the 1999-2000 NSSO data, a whole series of new questions were added. And one of the questions that was added was the location of work. So whether people work in offices like us, in enterprises, or whether they work at home, or they work in their own enterprises, or in somebody else's enterprises, or on construction sites, or on the streets, and so on and so forth. To my great surprise, I've discovered that the 2013 economic census had introduced this question. It's not there in the earlier thing. So it's a very interesting thing. I remember one very top economist once telling me that all these data sources suffer from some kind of an inertia. So either they don't change at all, or if they change, then it pervades. So then the question that we had introduced in the NSSO 99-2000 has continued to be there in the next rounds of quinquennial surveys. And I think Professor Ghosh and I, who were on that first standing committee which did the PDLF thing, I think we've managed to retain that location of work. I definitely hope we did. But so it's a very interesting thing that I first noticed this when we did our first informal sector survey in Ahmedabad. The number of people in the informal sector who were working in their homes, it actually shocked me. And now we find that if you look at the data coming either from the NSS or from the, and even in the economic census, and it's most unanticipated, 23% of all enterprises were operating from homes. And obviously it's much larger for own account enterprises. And then if you look at the manufacturing sector, so they are a very large proportion, and the whole hotelry. So this is a point that I'd like to make, because very often when we say informal sector, we kind of think that, and I hear a lot of it because I seem to go to all these kind of seminars and everybody talks about the person walking on the street and the street vendors and the porters and so on and so forth. Actually, manufacturing sector, a lot of it happens within the homes. It's a small enterprise thing, and it happens. So like 57% of own account enterprises in manufacturing sector are within the homes. Trade, of course, one can understand. You can have a shop within your house, you can have a shop in front of your house, at the back of your house, and etc. And so on. Then, of course, hotels and food, also one can understand that it is. Obviously, even establishments are those which hire a worker. They would obviously also have a lot of small ones. So they also operate, some of them do operate from the homes, but obviously you can see that it's a much, much, much larger proportion of enterprises. So this is another feature of the informal sector and informal, which also translates to the informal employment, which is a very, very important thing. Both these things, the fact that they are own account enterprises and the fact that a very large proportion operate from home, obviously tells us that the scale of operation is very small. When we were in the NCUS, we had this data, which is still one of the best that we have, about the value of assets, the fixed assets that they have. And we found some huge number, I've forgotten, which had less than rupees 5,000 as their fixed asset. What on earth can you get for rupees 5,000? So obviously these are very small scale enterprises. Right, so this is within household premises. Okay, just to say that that's not just something that came out of the blue. Similar proportions of own account enterprises and enterprises working from home. Obviously, you can't. These statistics will never give you the same number. These are also enterprise surveys of the NSSO. And these are those two surveys which are different from Arup's sector surveys. These surveys were for all enterprises, and it excluded construction, I think. So on account, so here in 10-11 it was done, and then it was done earlier also. It was done in 99-2000, along with the first 99-2000 informal employment stuff that we had entered into the NSSO. So then in 2010-11 and 15-16 this survey was done, and as you can see, this shows you in the informal sector, 82 to 95% of the 84% of them are in our own account in both years. And then here again you can see this growth of enterprises. But when you're taking the informal sector by itself, the growth of enterprises in this period is higher in the establishments. Which doesn't mean anything, it just means that there is a slightly larger enterprises, their scale and scope is a little larger than that of own account enterprises. And here if you look at the proportion within the household, again you find 43% of these informal enterprises are within the household. The other one that I showed you was all enterprises, all right? All enterprises recorded, because they do a house-to-house, structure-to-structure enumeration of enterprises in the economic census data. So you can see that nearly 30% were, or 20-something% were there, and here when you look at informal enterprises itself, about 40%. Now what I want to say is that fact that these own account enterprises and establishments are not all just something which is down in the dumps and let's forget about them. They are not down in the dumps. A very large proportion of them are driven, and they can expand, and they could be our source of employment, and they could be a source of very good employment if some kind of help, assistance, etc., is this thing to them. So when we look at this data, they have given us the proportion of them which are expanding, which are stagnant, and which are contracting. This may be small, but still about 30% of the enterprises say that they are expanding. And then, of course, you have the large component, which is like 45% of them, which are contracting. If you look at both the years, 10, 11, 15, the fact that 10, 11, and 15, 16 are not showing that different proportion, which are expanding and are stagnant and so on, gives you some confidence in the data. At least it's not just a goli mara or fir usko kuch bhi mil gaya, and 1 year they get 3%, another year they get 20%. It's not that way. So there's a stability. Whenever there is stability in the data, even in labor force, is something that my Professor Praveen Visari always told me. If you find the participation rates very similar to each other over various rounds, be happy about it. If it swings too much, dump it. Because it can't swing that much, basically, because a lot of this is structural, like somebody earlier was trying to say. All right? So my point is, all of on-account enterprises, all of informal enterprises are not subsistence. There is a segment of them, and there are various ways of delineating. Now, Arup tried some very sophisticated methods of trying when they are driven by the supply and driven by demand and so on and so forth. Now, for a very simple way of looking at it, I actually did a small exercise, and since we are completely running out of time, I'm not going to go through the exercise as such, but I tried to look at some of the variables which are, he did point out that enterprises which use computers and internet and so on are very low. And I asked this question, what are the characteristics of the firm? And certain institutional characteristics, institutional factors like government help and so on, associated with the expansion of, it's just a small logistic regression, and these are log odds ratios. So finally, what we do find is that so we have firm level characteristics, and then we have these three drivers or three institutional factors. And what we find is that being located in the household premise did not inhibit expansion. And then, of course, because I'm so obsessed with women enterprises, I have separated out male and female-owned enterprises. Both, it doesn't inhibit, it doesn't always inhibit their growth. So they may be small in scale, they might have little value of assets, they might have lower incomes and lower productivity, but they are, a very large proportion of them, or some proportion of them, are still expanding. Among the social groups, of course, that's an interesting phenomenon of interest to all of us, and to Amit maybe. Among the social groups, compared to castes, scheduled castes and tribes, proprietors belonging to the upper castes were less likely to expand. Now, I am not sure why this is happening. It is possible that the upper caste households which are here are either using it as a secondary employment. Their priorities are, if you read the literature on classes, because I did this thing on middle classes, they talk about the middle classes, always aspiring to be salaried. And so then they send their children off to education and so on and so forth. And that is the upward mobility that they find, and not continuing with these enterprises. So anyway, that is something to look at as to why particular castes might be the ones which are pursuing and are expanding their enterprises. In terms of age of the enterprise, they were younger. Firms which obviously with larger operation and establishments and hired workers were more likely to expand. That is, those that had higher value of assets, which were larger in size because of the fact that they had hired workers, were more likely to male-owned units that maintained books of account, which might have implied better organization of their activity, also were more likely to expand. The interesting result was this, a very simple one, that of course the use of internet the proportion was quite small, but that was one of the positive drivers of this growth, expanding firms. And registration with any statutory body, which was quite a bit, other than being actual formal, they might be registering on other, maybe for credit or maybe for something else, and those who received government assistance. Again, the proportion of enterprises that received government assistance was very low, was quite low. But when you look at it in terms of a driver of growth, in terms of a logistic regression, these three seem to be the three factors which were driving the expanding firms. And I didn't find any gender differentials in that. So basically, I would say that the importance of government support is important, though we didn't find credit being a thing. And there are other studies which have shown that the credit is not being such a crucial thing, because most of these enterprises, they take money from their friends and relatives and so on in order to be able to manage, which of course means that their capacity to expand would be restricted. So I'll conclude here. So basically my plea is that there is this huge proportion of enterprises which are in the informal sector. All of them are not dead and gone. A large proportion of them are likely to, at least a third of them are likely to be very enterprising enterprises, and with a little bit of help in terms of infrastructure, electricity and so on and so on, all the indicators which the more the World Bank study was showing, all the infrastructure facilities and so on can drive these enterprises, and it would be the the source of perhaps the source and the engine of growth of the future. Thank you.
Friends, we had 3 very good presentations. Professor Arup Mitra gave a very good overview of various factors and dynamism operating in the informal sector, which kind of factors are important, demand induced or supply pushed. Also he talked a lot about
Sir, can I ask? I'm no student, I teach here, but I have some query. So my question is to Dr. Jimol. Ma'am, you said that there is informal sector, means house-based enterprises which are increasing, expanding, but there is no significant connection between the credit market and the enterprises. But I have done my PhD on coexistence of formal and informal credit market on house-based industries, and I have done this empirical testing from house-based data, self-collected data from West Bengal, and I have seen, though it is not connected formally with the financial institution, but most of them, as it is female-run enterprise, most of them are member of self-help groups, and they have indirect connection with the formal sector financial assistance. Means maybe the male member of the family gets some kind of financial assistance formally for agriculture purpose, but they use it for other purposes, like they use it for consumption, their marriage, for their kids, as well as loan repayment of previous loan, and as well as they use that money, because these are very small scale enterprises, they use the leftover money for as an investment for this industry. So there is huge connection between this informal and formal credit market through these house-based industries. And as well as, I have another question to Dr. Mitra. Though it was very short timing, so I didn't get how you have used stochastic frontier analysis for making the index between, distance between this formal and informal sector, because and I didn't get which is the specific function that you have considered for stochastic frontier analysis.
Thank you. You have started. Yes. Any other question? Yes, please.
Sir, I am also not the student, but sir, I have a question. See, the common undercurrent in all the 3 presentations was that informal sector in a way provides an avenue to come somebody who is in dire poverty. He helps it's kind of a, although it is supposed to be a stepping stone, at least there is a temporary respite. The issue is the entire paradigm now shifting that from poverty to inequality, that if somebody enters the labor force at the age of about 18 or 19, and if he has to continue his entire working life in the informal sector with low productivity, low human possibilities for any kind of augmentation in human capital, and therefore limited opportunities for himself to upgrade in the formal sector, then do we accept that the entire paradigm has now shifted, that we will have to be in a perpetual inequality kind of a status? And then the question that you raised, then what should be the broad policy directive? Because all these years we were talking about tackling poverty, Now I think the focus will have to be shifted to tackling the issue of inequality. How do we go about it? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Sir?
Yes, yes.
So my
Most
name is
welcome.
Pranjali. I'm doing masters in economics from Symbiosis School of Economics. I'm a second year student. My question is, ma'am, you said that the assistance is being when the government assistance is provided, it impacts positively to informal sector enterprises. So my question is, should there be difference in the kind of assistance which should be given to males and females by the government to informal sector?
Good question. Yeah, any other? Acha, you think? Yes, please. Dr. Singh.
I'm taking the liberty which you said that you can ask questions generally and I get a sense that in recent times the government wishes to perhaps wish away the informal sector. In various ways there are policies and so on and so forth, or in the policy rhetoric it is sometimes, I get the feeling that they want to do that. So, if any of you could perhaps comment on that, is that something which I have misconstrued? Is that something which we have to be a little worried about?
Yeah. Yes, Samsundar.
The recent budget speech, the interim finance minister talked about Mudra scheme and startups and everything, and gave a new notion of employment creation, that self-employment, we no longer create people who want jobs, we create people who can create jobs. So there is a definite shift in the understanding of the notion of employment, from wage employment to self-employment, and by meaning self-employment, not a simple one-account enterprise in terms of involving the family members, but generating jobs, startups, stand-up, Mudra, etc., etc. And these are being legitimized. Are we witnessing a paradigm shift in the conception of employment itself? I know there is a distinction between work and employment, which Guy Standing made, but this government seems to be shifting it to a different understanding of employment. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question? Okay. If you have some question, you can ask after 5. Yeah, Dr. Jyoti.
Okay, I'm loud enough. The very fact that we have a very high informal sector and a high unorganized sector, I think Indians have always been very averse to scale, and therefore the scale economies are absolutely favorable, and that's why it very much exists. I just want one of you to validate this point if your research works in this direction. Right?
Okay, now respond. You can start in 1 minute. You take 2 minutes. And while responding, you can now ask question to Ravi if you wish so.
I can ask them outside. So, your question about credit. Actually, this is the very important thing about micro-studies. Micro-studies and large-scale data, the problem that we had, that they didn't even want the NSSO for quinquennial data and survey to be done, and they want to throw that all out. It's basically because of time and money involved in this whole thing. So they can't ask very detailed questions in any survey that they are doing. Now, how are they defining credit in this? That we'll have to check on this thing. It's probably formal from formal institutions. So a lot of these other channels, which ultimately are formal in the sense that through groups and things like that, might not be captured also in these data. So we are not sure exactly how it is coming out in this informal enterprises survey. So, but then once we get this kind of information, in the, we had this problem in the 73rd round. I was in that committee which formed 73rd round is another informal enterprise survey. I don't remember which year that becomes. They had added people in self-help groups as workers and treated them as enterprises and workers. And I don't know how I missed it in the first sort of round. And then, when it came up again, it was not in the PDLS, right? It was in the 73rd round data. And then I said that no, they cannot be treated as workers. They are not actually workers, and they are not enterprises. So, but there was an effort to calculate. So now you actually have a separate estimate of how many women are associated with self-help groups. It's a very interesting thing. First, they had added it into their enterprises and into their thing. So then they had to rework the whole thing, and they removed it. And they removed it from the earlier round also. So that idea that self-help groups is an important thing had entered into the NSSO's brain, and it had appeared there. But then they were classifying it wrongly, because you cannot treat them as workers or as enterprises. But you get that extra information as to how many of them are there in that. So so that this kind of information can actually help to improve the questionnaire, improve the codes that they're giving in order to be able to capture this information. And as far as drivers of growth is concerned, actually we are actually doing a book, and we have used this data for the informal sector enterprises, and then we have used World Bank enterprise data actually to look at innovation of women and men owner enterprises in the formal sector. Now, why do we have to go and use the World Bank data when we have ASI data and so on and so forth? You might think the ASI data very smartly does not tell us the gender of the owner of that enterprise. So whereas the informal enterprises survey tells us the gender of ownership, the ASI data does not tell us. I know it is difficult to say that, because there will always be men and women in larger enterprises. What the World Bank has done is that enterprise survey, what they have done is they have said you are an all-male enterprise, or you are an enterprise with women workers. So at least you get some sense of enterprises which are women. The ASI, you just can't use the ASI data if you want to do anything with regard to enterprises. And there we find a difference in the drivers for women and men. And so, for example, the fact that you have a very poor regulatory environment affects women entrepreneurs more, women-owned enterprises more than the male-owned enterprises. But in the case of this particular variable that they had used, these three variables that we found that we could use, because the number of questions they ask are so few that whole data set is geared towards calculating value added, and that's all they're doing, because it's really an effort to be able to get value added per worker to use to get the proper estimate of the GDP. That is what those enterprise surveys are meant to do, and they've always been meant to do that. So they don't give any other information. The World Bank Enterprise Survey asks about innovation, it asks about a whole lot of institutional factors, there are all kinds of data in that, so you have to use various data sources and then see whether these are validating each other, and that's the only way you can understand how this economy works, or how the small enterprises and large enterprises also in this country work. So as far as the substance is concerned, it doesn't, but then there are other data sets which will tell you what is it which is more important for women entrepreneurs as compared to male entrepreneurs and so on.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alak. Most of the questions ended up coming from you, so much the audience. But let me begin with Jayaveer's rather simple question, which is this recent policy towards formalization, or if you like it, forced formalization, which is what the government has tried to do. As Alak pointed out, the informal sector or the informal economy is a very heterogeneous economy, and at the apex there are entities in the informal economy who actually use their, basically are there because they evade the regulatory apparatus, which is tax. Now, what the government did was use their presence or this thing within the informal economy to attempt a forced formalization of this very vast heterogeneous informal economy, and which ended up doing an enormous amount of damage, which we are still living through as far as both employment, as far as the informal economy, the genuine subsistence informal economy, or more than subsistence informal economy is consistent. The employment and incomes are, the two parts of the same thing. If you compress one, the other goes down, and typically that is what happened post demonetization. So I think that was really the wrong way to go about, conflating the entire informal economy into one kind of homogeneous set, and attempting this forced formalization. Now this question which Alak raised, basically how to formalize, right? Why is there this predominance of the informal economy? But this is actually a very serious question, and there's not something we cannot really answer in 1 minute or 2 minutes, but I'll just say a couple of things. In fact, in the NCUS, we had put forward proposals for 2 reports, which remained proposals because we had to wind up our work in 2009. One had to do with gender and informality, where we had actually already had discussions within the commission, and the other was this whole question of barriers to formalization. How do you actually overcome the barriers to formalization? And what we did find, and we put this across in the report on conditions of livelihood, but this is something which requires a lot more research, and I don't think we've done that kind of research. The World Bank has done something, and ILO has done something, but just not enough. 3 things. One, the regulatory, in the 90s, this concept was there, probably correct, that the reservation of enterprises and so on and so forth, restricted markets had allowed these small-scale enterprises to proliferate. So through the 90s up to 2004-05, there was deregulation. But the fact of the matter is that the regulations which exist, and these are all kinds of regulations, right? On small vending, on this, on that, etc. These regulations are very anti-poor. They're very anti-informal sector. And there has been some studies of the kind. So one is the regulatory apparatus itself. Secondly, systematically, not only were the support props, let's say technology hubs and many other things, because externalities exist. There are spillovers, there are externalities, whether you look at clusters or other enterprises, and they needed to continue doing their role post-liberalization. But they stopped that. The share of credit to micro enterprises systematically went down. And in the NCUS, we looked at this very, very closely. So basically, the support structures, which what Jimol pointed out, completely got eroded. And that is something which continued to contribute to the informalization of this whole economy. And I think this is the third is the more persistent thing, right? We have the formal-informal linkage. It's not all benign, in the sense that whether you call it benign or not, but the value chains extend to all parts of the subsistence production structure. Look at garments. I mean, it's impossible. 80% of garment production in India is precisely in this sector, and a lot of it is either domestic value chains or global value chains. So the one other way of actually trying to address this through policy is what the NCUS called the leveling up strategy. Look at minimum wages, minimum conditions of work. Bring out workers into the realm of minimum wages. Evaluate the skills that they put in. So social protection and social security. If you start doing this, then also you will have, enterprises will be forced to focus, large enterprises will be forced to focus on productivity improvements rather than simple, taking recourse to smaller, subsistence level enterprises down the value chain. So these are very quick sort of answers to your questions.
Some of the primary survey results again show that several benefits are associated with being located in the informal sector. So there is a single enterprise, but under different names, he wants to remain small within the informal sector. particularly if you look at Shugata Majid's work. And some of these informal sector enterprises are actually trading with the foreign countries, yet they are shown to be in the informal sector. So from that point of view, I think Modiji's attempt is to impose taxes, if you can consolidate them and if you can bring them to the formal sector. Of course, as Professor Srivastava pointed out, that it should not be addressed uniformly to all the units, and it is a highly heterogeneous sector. But definitely there is one spectrum of such units which can be consolidated and which can actually be compelled to register in the formal sector, and they should be liable to pay taxes. The other point which you raised, that what we have done, it is try to imagine a cost function frontier, not a production function frontier. So what is the minimum level of informal sector employment is associated with different components of employment in the formal sector. First, in absolute terms, we have divided the formal and informal sector employment, and we have also considered the composition of formal sector employment. Then in a Cobb-Douglas function framework, and also in the translog framework, we have tried to see the relationship between the informal sector and the composition of formal sector. When you then apply the frontier function framework, you are able to decompose the error in terms of V and U, and U can then be attributed to the distance from the frontier. Higher the distance, higher is the excess supplies of labor. And as I mentioned, we have tried to do it for 99, 2000 and 2004 in such a manner that you can compare. So there is only one benchmark, that is Mizoram, for 99, 2000. In relation to that, the rest of the states have been indexed. And the conclusion is that many states which had recorded a lower value of index in 99-2000 had actually experienced a very high value of index in 2004-05, which tends to indicate that excess supplies are also increasing very rapidly. So there is a dynamic sector which is emerging, and at the same time the supply push phenomenon is also getting quite predominant. The other point, yes, we do get to see that there are a lot of links between the formal and the informal sector, garment for example. But why the percolation effect is not working? As I was mentioning, Gary Fields argued that if one sector is expanding through subcontracting and ancillarization, the other sector should increase and wages should increase. If regularization within the irregular sector is taking place, because if I am your labor, you wouldn't like to leave me so gently, because your labor turnover cost is going to be very high. So obviously you would offer me a little higher wages than the ongoing wage rate. In that case, regularization within the irregular sector can take place, and hence percolation effect can occur. But yet it is not occurring. That is because through our qualitative surveys we pointed out the number of middlemen that has increased, and secondly, the wage rate has been converted from weekly and daily to piece rate basis, and that piece rate wage rate is declining. Thank you.
Thank you. Friends, you will agree that this has been a very fascinating session. Good presentations and also good discussions. I would like to thank all the paper writers. Let us give them a big hand. And also thank you for your indulgence, for your interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you, dear guest and panel, for such an informative session.